The clock on the wall ticked with an almost cruel precision, each second stretching longer than the last. I sat at my desk in the corner of the office, pretending to focus on the spreadsheet glowing faintly on my monitor. The hum of fluorescent lights above mingled with the low murmur of colleagues chatting about weekend plans and gossip they'd probably forget by Monday. But none of it reached me. Not really. My mind was elsewhere, tangled up in thoughts I'd spent years trying to untangle. Today wasn't just another day at work. It was the day before my engagement party. Tomorrow evening, I would stand beside Sarah, the woman everyone expected me to marry, smiling for photos while friends and family toasted our future together. On paper, we were perfect. She was kind, intelligent, beautiful, the kind of person anyone would be lucky to call their partner. And yet, here I was staring blankly at numbers that blurred into meaningless shapes, feeling like a stranger in my own life. That IT wasn't that I didn't care about her. I did deeply. She deserved someone who could give her everything, someone whole. But how could I explain that I wasn't? How could I tell her, or anyone, that there was this hollow space inside me, one I'd tried so hard to fill but never quite managed? It wasn't until recently that I even understood what, or rather, who belonged in that space. And then there was Daniel, that he walked into my life 6 months ago, hired as part of a new team brought in to revamp our company's marketing strategy. From the moment he introduced himself during a department meeting, something about him caught me off guard. Maybe it was the way his voice carried just enough confidence without veering into arrogance, or the quiet intensity in his gaze when he spoke. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the way he smiled, slow and deliberate, like he knew exactly how much power it held over people. Whatever it was, it unsettled me in ways I couldn't ignore. At first, I told myself it was harmless admiration. After all, Daniel was magnetic. He had this effortless charm that drew people to him. Everyone seemed to gravitate toward him, whether it was because of his sharp wit or the easy way he made conversation flow. Even Sarah liked him, often commenting on how refreshing it was to meet someone so genuine. But the truth was, no one saw him the way I did. No one noticed the small things. The way his fingers drummed lightly against his coffee cup when he was deep in thought, or how his laugh softened slightly when he found something truly funny. These details weren't meant for anyone else. They felt like secrets only I was allowed to know. Still, I fought against it. Every time I caught myself lingering too long on the curve of his jawline or the way his shirt sleeves hugged his forearms, I forced myself to look away. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was engaged, for God's sake. Engaged to a woman I loved and respected more than anyone else in the world. Yet no matter how many times I reminded myself of that fact, it didn't change the ache in my chest whenever Daniel walked past my desk, or the way my pulse quickened when he leaned close to ask a question, his breath warm against my ear. The tension between us grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like cracks forming in ice. At first, it was just casual exchanges, comments about projects, shared glances across the room. Then came the moments that lingered just a beat too long. The silences heavy with unspoken words. Once, after a particularly late night at the office, we ended up alone in the break room. He stood near the sink, rinsing out his mug, while I hovered awkwardly by the coffee machine. Neither of us said anything for a while, the quiet broken only by the soft clink of ceramic against metal. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable, and asked, "You okay?" His tone was gentle, almost hesitant, but there was something beneath it, a curiosity, maybe even concern. I nodded quickly, mumbling something about being tired, and escaped before he could press further. But later, lying in bed next to Sarah, I replayed the moment over and over in my head. What if I hadn't left? What if I'd stayed and let him see the mess I was inside? That question haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Because the truth was, I wanted him to see. I wanted him to understand the weight I carried every day, the guilt and fear and longing that twisted together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. But letting him in meant risking everything. The life I'd built, the promises I'd made, the image of myself I'd worked so hard to maintain. And yet, the alternative, keeping him at arm's length, felt unbearable too that as the days passed, the pull between us became impossible to deny. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was deeper, more primal. With Daniel, I felt seen in a way I never had before, like he could peel back all the layers I'd hidden behind and still find something worth holding on to. And maybe that scared me most of all. Tomorrow, I would put on a suit and smile for pictures, raising a glass to a future I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Tonight, though, I sat in silence, listening to the clock tick and wondering if Daniel was thinking about me too. The morning after that restless night, I arrived at the office early, hoping to lose myself in work before anyone else showed up. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every footstep echo and every rustle of papers sound deafening. I'd brought a thermos of coffee with me, its warmth seeping through my fingers as I settled into my chair. For a while, it worked. I managed to focus on drafting an email, then another, until the hum of productivity drowned out the chaos in my head. And then I heard it, the faint creak of the door opening behind me. My stomach tightened instinctively, though I didn't turn around right away. It wasn't unusual for other early risers to trickle in, but something about the timing felt deliberate, like whoever had entered knew they'd find me here alone. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, there he was, Daniel, standing just inside the doorway with his messenger bag slung casually over one shoulder. His hair was damp from what I assumed was a quick shower, and he wore a plain gray hoodie that somehow made him look even more approachable than usual. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but steady. There was no hint of surprise in his expression, which struck me as odd. Had he been looking for me? Or was this coincidence? "Hey," I replied, forcing a neutral tone despite the sudden flutter in my chest. "You're here early. So are you." He smirked slightly, stepping closer until he reached the edge of my desk. "Guess we're both avoiding traffic." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Up close, he smelled faintly of soap and something earthy, like cedarwood. It was distracting, especially when paired with the way his eyes seemed to linger on mine just a fraction longer than necessary. Clearing my throat, I gestured vaguely toward the stack of folders beside me. "Just catching up on some stuff before the day gets hectic." He nodded, leaning against the desk with an ease that bordered on casual intimacy. "Mind if I join you? The break room's kind of lonely this time of day." It wasn't exactly a question, but I hesitated anyway. Letting him sit there felt dangerous, like inviting a storm into a fragile glass house. Still, I couldn't think of a reason to say no without seeming rude. "Sure," I muttered, shifting uncomfortably in my seat as he pulled up a chair. For the next hour, we talked, or rather, he did most of the talking. Daniel had a way of making conversation feel effortless, weaving anecdotes about his weekend hiking trip or his latest attempt at cooking pasta into the discussion. Occasionally, he'd pause to ask a question about me, and each time, I found myself scrambling to come up with answers that didn't reveal too much. It wasn't that I didn't trust him. It was that I didn't trust myself. Every word I spoke felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between honesty and self-preservation. At one point, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and fixed me with a look that sent a jolt through my system. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked abruptly, his tone uncharacteristically serious. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it hit so painfully close to home. Swallowing hard, I forced a laugh. "Isn't that just adulthood?" He didn't laugh back. Instead, his gaze softened, almost sympathetically. "Maybe, but sometimes I wonder if we're all just playing roles we don't really want. Like, what happens when you stop pretending?" His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the doubts gnawing at me, the secrets I could barely admit to myself. But instead, I shrugged, deflecting with a joke. "We probably implode, or get fired. Take your pick." To my relief, he chuckled, breaking the tension. "Fair enough. Just thought I'd ask." But the moment stayed with me long after he left to start his own day. What would happen if I stopped pretending? If I let myself be honest, not just with Daniel, but with Sarah, with my family, with the world? The idea terrified me, not because I feared rejection, though that was certainly part of it, but because it meant dismantling the carefully constructed facade I'd spent years building. Who would I be without it? As the hours passed, I tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the endless stream of emails and meetings that filled my schedule. Yet no matter how busy I kept myself, Daniel's presence lingered in the corners of my mind. During lunch, I caught glimpses of him chatting animatedly with co-workers in the cafeteria, his laughter carrying across the room. Later, in a team meeting, he sat 2 seats away from me, occasionally glancing in my direction with an unreadable expression. Each interaction, however fleeting, felt charged with meaning, as though he were silently daring me to confront the truth I'd been running from. By the end of the day, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, but sleep eluded me once again. Lying awake in bed, I replayed every word Daniel had said, every glance he'd given me. Was it possible he suspected something? Or worse, did he already know? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me, followed quickly by shame. Why should it matter if he knew? Shouldn't I be proud of who I am, regardless of what others thought? And yet, pride felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Growing up, I'd learned early on that being different came with consequences, judgment, ridicule, isolation. Even now, as an adult, the fear of losing everything I'd worked for loomed large. Sarah, my career, my reputation, they were all tied to the version of myself I presented to the world. To change that narrative felt like risking everything. Still, there was no denying the pull Daniel had on me. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the way he challenged me, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd buried long ago. With him, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, like I was finally waking up after a lifetime of sleepwalking. And maybe that was worth the risk. The next morning, I resolved to face him head on. Whatever this thing between us was, attraction, curiosity, something deeper, I needed to understand it. More importantly, I needed to understand myself. So when I saw him waiting by the elevator bank, coffee cup in hand, I took a deep breath and approached him. "You heading upstairs?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the nervous energy coursing through me. He turned, his lips curving into that same slow smile that always seemed to unravel me. "Yeah, you. Same." I stepped into the elevator beside him, acutely aware of the confined space and the faint scent of his cologne. As the doors slid shut, trapping us together, I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me. This was my chance to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. Instead, we rode in silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. When the elevator dinged and the doors opened, Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering near the button. Then, without warning, he pressed it again, sending us back down to the lobby. "What are you doing?" I blurted out. Startled, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Buying us some time." "For what?" "For whatever this is." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that left me breathless. "Because I can't keep pretending either." The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me momentarily speechless. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one struggling. Whatever connection existed between us, it ran deeper than I dared to imagine. And as the elevator descended, I knew there was no turning back. The elevator ride back to the lobby felt endless, though in reality, it lasted only seconds. When the doors slid open again, Daniel stepped out first, motioning for me to follow him. We walked in silence toward a quiet corner of the building, where a row of large windows overlooked the city skyline. The early morning light streamed through the glass, casting soft golden hues across the polished floor. It was peaceful here, far removed from the usual bustle of the office. Daniel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He didn't look at me immediately. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, his profile illuminated by the rising sun. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the urgency in his voice just moments ago. But then he spoke, his tone measured but tinged with vulnerability. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, still not meeting my eyes. "A lot." His words landed like a stone dropped into calm water, sending ripples through my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I've been thinking about him too? That every glance, every accidental brush of our hands had left me breathless and confused. I don't know what this is, he continued, finally turning to face me. But I can't ignore it anymore. And I think maybe you feel it too. His gaze was searching, almost pleading, and it undid me. My defenses crumbled under the weight of his honesty. I nodded slowly, swallowing past the lump in my throat. Yeah, I whispered. Ido. Relief washed over his features, followed quickly by something else. Hope, perhaps, or determination. He straightened up, taking a small step closer. Good, because I'm tired of pretending, tired of wondering if I'm imagining things. The space between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap completely, but fear held me back. This was dangerous territory, uncharted and unpredictable. Yet, standing there with him, bathed in the warm glow of dawn, it felt impossible to resist. Over the next few weeks, we found ways to carve out moments together. Sometimes it was as simple as lingering in the break room after lunch, sharing stories about childhood memories or favorite books. Other times, it was more deliberate, an impromptu coffee run during a slow afternoon, or a late-night work session that stretched far beyond its original purpose. Each interaction deepened the connection between us, layering intimacy onto intimacy until it became hard to imagine how I'd ever lived without it. One evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Daniel suggested we grab dinner nearby. You've been holed up in here all day, he said, leaning casually against my desk. You need fresh air. And food. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. Technically, I should have been heading home to Sarah, who would undoubtedly be waiting for me. But the thought of spending another night pretending everything was fine felt suffocating. Okay, I agreed, surprising even myself. Just for an hour. The restaurant he chose was cozy, tucked away on a side street lined with twinkling string lights. Inside, the atmosphere was intimate, with low lighting and soft jazz playing faintly in the background. We slid into a booth near the window, the table small enough that our knees bumped whenever one of us shifted. Neither of us apologized for IT to AS we ate. The conversation flowed effortlessly, ranging from lighthearted banter to deeper topics. At one point, Daniel asked about my family, his expression curious but gentle. Do they know? He ventured carefully, leaving the question open-ended. Know what? I replied, stalling for time, even though I knew exactly what he meant. That you're gay. His bluntness caught me off guard, but there was no judgment in his voice. Only understanding that I looked down at my plate, tracing the edge of my fork with my thumb. No, I admitted quietly. They don't. Not really. I mean, they suspect, I think, but we don't talk about it. It's easier that way. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Easier for them. Or for you? For everyone, I guess. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It's complicated. My parents are old school. You know? They love me, but they wouldn't understand. And Sarah, my voice trailed off, guilt twisting in my stomach. She deserves better than this. Daniel reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine lightly. The touch was brief, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. Better than what? He asked softly. Than someone who loves her but isn't fully themselves? Or than someone who's scared to admit the truth? His words struck a nerve, exposing the raw ache I'd been trying so hard to bury. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked rapidly to keep them at bay. I don't want to hurt her, I murmured, but I don't know how to stop hurting myself either. You're not alone in this, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the emotion thickening in the air. Whatever happens, I'm here. Okay. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. In that moment, sitting across from him in the dimly lit restaurant, I felt seen in a way I never had before. Not judged, not pitted, just understood. After dinner, we decided to walk back to the office rather than take a cab. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. Streetlights cast long shadows along the pavement, their golden glow reflecting off puddles scattered here and there. We walked side by side, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed, but neither of us pulled away. At one point, Daniel stopped abruptly, pulling me aside into a narrow alleyway between two buildings. Before I could ask what he was doing, he pressed me gently against a brick wall, his hands resting lightly on my hips. My breath hitched, heart pounding wildly in my chest. "We shouldn't," I started, but he silenced me with a finger to my lips. "Just let me hold you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "For 1 minute. Please." How could I refuse? His touch was tender, reverent, as though he were afraid I might break. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to simply exist, to feel without worrying about consequences or expectations. When we finally parted, both of us were breathless, cheeks flushed from the cold, and something else entirely. "We should go," I said reluctantly, though neither of us moved right away. "Yeah," Daniel agreed, his smile bittersweet. "But tomorrow, can we do this again?" I nodded, my heart swelling with a mix of joy and terror. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and the one after that, felt uncertain, fragile. But for now, it was enough. The days that followed our stolen moment in the alley blurred together, each one stretching longer than the last. I tried to act normal around Sarah, smiling through conversations and pretending everything was fine, but the weight of my secret pressed down on me like a stone. Every glance at Daniel across the office sent a jolt of electricity through me, yet it was laced with guilt. Guilt for what I felt, guilt for what I hadn't said, and guilt for knowing that sooner or later, something had to give at IT happened on a Friday evening, after another long week of skirting the edges of truth. The office was nearly empty, save for a few stragglers packing up their things before heading home. I stayed late, as usual, using work as an excuse to avoid going back to Sarah's apartment. She'd texted earlier, asking when I'd be home, but I'd brushed her off with a vague promise of soon. Daniel lingered too, though I didn't realize it until I heard his voice behind me. "You're still here?" I turned, startled, finding him leaning against the doorway of my cubicle. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone, and his hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, a habit I'd come to recognize whenever he was deep in thought. He looked tired but determined, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "I could say the same about you," I replied, forcing a lightness into my tone that didn't quite reach my voice. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," he said simply, stepping closer. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty. Just purpose that my breath caught in my throat. "Why?" "Because we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but steady. "This dance, pretending we don't feel what we feel. It's killing me, and I know it's killing you too." His words hit like a punch, knocking the air out of me. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the stack of papers scattered across my desk. "It's not that simple," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "It is," he countered, his tone softening. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at me when you think no one's watching. The way you pull back every time we get close. You're scared, and I get it. But running won't fix this. Staying silent won't either." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "And what do you want me to do, Daniel? Just walk away from everything? From Sarah? From the life I've built?" "No," he said firmly, taking another step forward until there was barely any space between us. "I want you to stop lying. To her, to yourself, to me. I want you to admit that you feel this too. That whatever's happening between us isn't just some fluke or mistake." His proximity was overwhelming, his presence consuming every inch of the room. My heart raced, torn between the desire to push him away and the need to pull him closer. "And then what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What happens after that?" "I don't know," he admitted, his gaze never wavering. "But isn't it worth finding out?" Before I could respond, he closed the remaining distance between us, his hand reaching up to cup my cheek. His touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine. For a moment, I froze, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what was happening. Then, slowly, instinctively, I leaned into him, letting my eyes drift shut as his thumb brushed gently over my skin. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. "If you don't want this, tell me now." But I couldn't. Not when every fiber of my being screamed for more. Not when the ache inside me begged to be filled. So instead, I reached up, threading my fingers through his hair, and pulled him closer. Our lips met in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender, a collision of longing and vulnerability that left me dizzy. Time seemed to stop. The world outside, the office, the city, everything faded into nothingness, leaving only the two of us. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me flush against him, and I melted into the embrace, surrendering to the flood of emotions I'd spent so long trying to suppress. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and raw and achingly real. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other's. Neither of us spoke right away, the silence heavy with unspoken words and unresolved questions. Finally, Daniel let out a shaky laugh, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Well," he said softly, "that changes things." Tears welled in my eyes, spilling over despite my best efforts to hold them back. "I'm so sorry," I choked out, the weight of everything crashing down on me at once. "For Sarah. For lying. Hey," he interrupted, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Don't apologize for feeling. Not to me. Not ever." His reassurance should have comforted me, but it only deepened the storm raging inside. Because now there was no going back. This moment, this kiss, it changed everything. It meant facing truths I'd buried, making choices I wasn't ready for, and risking losing people I loved. But even as fear clawed at the edges of my mind, I couldn't bring myself to regret it that we stood there for what felt like hours, holding on to each other as though afraid the other might disappear. Eventually, reality crept back in, reminding us of the world waiting beyond this fragile bubble we'd created. Reluctantly, we stepped apart, though neither of us let go completely. "What happens now?" I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me since the beginning. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have all the answers, but I do know one thing. We can't keep hiding. Not from ourselves, and not from the people who deserve the truth." He was right, of course. As much as I wanted to stay in this moment forever, shielding myself from the consequences, I knew it wasn't fair. To Sarah, to Daniel, or to me. Whatever came next would be painful, messy, and uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, it would also be worth it today as we gathered our things and prepared to leave the office. I felt a strange mix of dread and hope swirling in my chest. The road ahead was unclear, fraught with challenges I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But for the first time, I wasn't walking it alone. The weekend that followed felt like an eternity. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the weight of what had happened and what still needed to happen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face, felt the ghost of his lips against mine. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once, a reminder of everything I wanted but wasn't sure I deserved. Sarah noticed something was off almost immediately. She'd always been perceptive, picking up on the subtle shifts in my mood long before I even realized they were there. On Saturday morning, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, she finally called me out. "You've been distant," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" I froze, my fork hovering midair. The question hung between us, heavy with unspoken implications. How could I answer honestly without shattering the fragile illusion we'd built together? Instead, I forced a smile, deflecting with a vague excuse about work stress. "Just tired," I lied, avoiding her gaze. "This project has been draining." She nodded, though skepticism lingered in her expression. "If you need to talk, you know I'm here, right?" Her kindness only made it worse, twisting the knife of guilt deeper into my chest. Of course she was here. For years, she'd been my rock, my confidant, my partner. And now, because of my selfishness, I was about to destroy everything we'd built. But how could I keep living a lie when the truth burned so brightly inside me? By Sunday evening, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Sarah deserved better than half-truths and evasions. So after dinner, I asked her to sit down, my heart pounding wildly as I prepared to say the words I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. She tilted her head, curiosity mingling with apprehension. "What is it?" Taking a deep breath, I plunged forward, spilling everything. The confusion, the doubts, the feelings I'd tried so hard to suppress. When I mentioned Daniel, her expression shifted, pain flickering across her features like a shadow passing over the sun. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. I thought, I thought maybe it was something else. Work pressure, or maybe. Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. How long? I don't know, I admitted, guilt choking my words. A while. Maybe longer than I realized. She stood abruptly, pacing the room as she processed the revelation. Did you ever love me? She asked suddenly, her tone raw and vulnerable. Or was it all just pretending? No, I insisted, reaching for her hand. Of course I loved you. I do love you, just not the way you deserve. Her fingers slipped through mine, retreating as though burned. Then why didn't you say something sooner? Why drag this out until him? I was scared. I confessed, my own tears spilling over now. Scared of losing you, of disappointing everyone. Scared of being wrong. For a long moment, she simply stared at me, her emotions warring behind tear-filled eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the wreckage of our relationship. AT work on Monday. Things weren't much better. News traveled fast in our office, especially when it came to personal drama. By lunchtime, whispers had already started circulating. Hushed conversations in hallways, sidelong glances whenever Daniel or I passed by. Some people avoided us altogether, while others approached with thinly veiled curiosity, asking questions under the guise of concern. Daniel, for his part, handled it with remarkable grace. He didn't shy away from the attention, nor did he feed into the gossip. Instead, he met every stare and awkward comment with quiet confidence, refusing to let anyone dictate how he should feel. Still, I could see the toll it took on him, the tightness around his jaw, the slight hesitation in his step. We both knew this wouldn't be easy, but facing it together somehow made it bearable. One afternoon, as we found ourselves alone in the break room, he leaned against the counter and sighed heavily. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said, his tone resigned but resolute. "Are you ready for that?" "I don't think anyone's ever really ready for this kind of mess," I replied, running a hand through my hair. "But I can't go back. Not anymore." He nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile. "Good." "Because neither can I." As the days turned into weeks, the fallout continued to ripple outward, touching every corner of my life. My parents called one evening, their voices sharp with disapproval. "We raised you to have integrity." My father snapped, his disappointment cutting deeper than any lecture ever could. "Is this how you repay us?" My mother, ever the peacemaker, tried to soften the blow, urging me to reconsider. "It's not too late to fix this," she said gently. "People make mistakes. You can still choose the right path." But what was the right path? Their version of morality felt suffocating, rooted in expectations I'd never asked for. Yet walking away from them meant severing ties with the very foundation of who I was, or at least who I thought I was. Each conversation left me more conflicted, questioning whether I was brave or reckless, honest or selfish. Through it all, Daniel remained my anchor. He listened patiently as I vented my frustrations, held me when the weight of it all became too much, and reminded me why we'd chosen this path in the first place. "You're not doing this for me," he said one night, his arms wrapped tightly around me. "You're doing it for you. Don't lose sight of that." His words stayed with me, grounding me during moments of doubt. Slowly, painfully, I began to piece myself back together. Not as the person I'd pretended to be, but as someone new, someone real. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but for the first time, it felt authentic. Still, questions lingered. Would Sarah ever forgive me? Could I repair the bridges I'd burned with my family? And most importantly, could Daniel and I survive the storm we'd unleashed? For now, the answers remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the uncertain future. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back. Not now, not after coming this far. Months passed, each day bringing its own challenges and small victories. The initial storm of gossip and judgment at work eventually subsided, replaced by a quieter kind of tension, one that came with knowing eyes and lingering whispers. But Daniel and I had learned to weather it together, carving out moments of peace amidst the chaos. We didn't hold hands in the hallways or steal kisses in empty conference rooms. Instead, we found solace in shared glances, brief touches when no one was looking, and late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Sarah and I hadn't spoken since that night in her apartment. She'd moved out shortly afterward, leaving behind only a note that read, "I hope you find what you're looking for." At first, her absence left a void, so profound it felt like losing a part of myself. But over time, I began to understand that what we'd shared, though real and meaningful, had been built on a foundation of half-truths. Letting her go wasn't just about freeing her. It was about freeing me too. My parents, however, remained a harder bridge to cross. After weeks of silence, my mother finally reached out, her voice tentative but warm. "Your father and I have been talking," she said during one of our rare phone calls. "We may not agree with your choices, but we love you. That hasn't changed." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not because they erased the pain of their earlier rejection, but because they offered a lifeline. Slowly, haltingly, we began to rebuild our relationship, piece by fragile piece. It wasn't easy. There were still arguments, misunderstandings, and moments when the old wounds threatened to reopen. But through it all, I held on to the belief that love, even flawed, imperfect love, was worth fighting for. For Daniel and me, our connection deepened with every passing day. What had started as a spark of attraction had grown into something far greater: trust, partnership, and an unshakable bond. One evening, as we sat side by side on his couch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he turned to me with a soft smile. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't taken that elevator ride?" I chuckled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "All the time. Maybe I'd still be stuck pretending to be someone I'm not. Or maybe," he mused, brushing a strand of hair from my face, "you'd have figured it out anyway. You're stronger than you think, you know." His faith in me was humbling, a reminder of how far I'd come since those sleepless nights spent wrestling with doubt and fear. I wasn't the same person who'd once hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. I was raw, vulnerable, and imperfect, but I was also free. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning. That freedom didn't mean the world suddenly became easier to navigate. There were still days when the weight of everything, the loss, the uncertainty, the lingering scars felt overwhelming. On those days, Daniel was my anchor, reminding me that healing wasn't linear. "You don't have to have everything figured out," he told me once, his arms wrapped tightly around me. "Just take it one step at a time." And so I did. Step by step, I rebuilt not just my relationships with others, but with myself. I rediscovered passions I'd long abandoned: painting, hiking, writing letters to old friends I'd let slip away. I started therapy, learning to unpack years of buried emotions and confront the fears that had once ruled my life. Most importantly, I gave myself permission to exist fully, without apology or shame. By the end of the year, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Sarah and I exchanged emails occasionally, polite and distant, but tinged with a quiet understanding. My parents invited me to dinner one weekend, where we tiptoed around sensitive topics, but managed to laugh together for the first time in months. And Daniel? He remained my constant, my partner in every sense of the word, that on New Year's Eve, we stood together on the rooftop of his building, watching fireworks light up the city skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of snow, and the crowd below erupted in cheers as the clock struck midnight. Daniel slipped his hand into mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as naturally as breathing. "Happy New Year," he whispered, pulling me close. "Happy New Year," I echoed, my heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, surrounded by the promise of a fresh start, I realized something profound. Happiness wasn't about having all the answers. It was about embracing the journey, the messy, beautiful, unpredictable journey, and trusting that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward. That as the fireworks faded and the crowd began to disperse, I turned to him, my voice steady despite the emotion welling inside me. "Thank you," I said simply, "for everything." He smiled, his gaze warm and unwavering. "Always." And with that, we stepped into the new year together, not bound by guarantees or promises, but by the unshakable knowledge that whatever lay ahead, we would face it side by side.